Lolita isn't an easy book to understand. As others have pointed out, diving into the discourse surrounding it is like diving into the ocean. You can swim all you like, but just when you think you found the water's edge, you round a craggy headland and realise you were only exploring a lagoon, a fraction of all there is to explore. To call the analysis of this book saturated would be an understatement. Whole academic careers have been dedicated to its study. Every time I thought I had a handle on some aspect of it, I'd find a new article or a new piece of evidence that changed everything. See, my feelings towards Lolita went through 3 stages. The first is one any of you who have read the book will be familiar with. The visceral reaction, God, this is disgusting, who would write this about a 12-year-old girl? Then, as I read on, I moved into the second stage. Again, one anyone who's read the book will be familiar with, the "oh right, he's meant to be the bad guy" stage. I realised the narrator, Humbert, through whose eyes we see the sexualisation of the eponymous child, is unreliable and disturbed, and the reader is meant to be repulsed by him. It was in this second stage that I finished the book, content with its masterful prose and challenging subject matter. I wouldn't call it a pleasant read, but an engaging one, sure. I could have happily stopped here. But I went looking for more. After Lolita, I thought Vladimir Nabokov could be my next literary obsession. I saw he had quite a few other novels, and even an autobiography. I started reading, and here's where I slipped slowly, reluctantly, into a third stage of understanding. I can't see Lolita in the same way. Nabokov has 19 novels, as well as dozens of poems and short stories and essays, autobiographical pieces, and lectures. I haven't read everything he's ever written, but what I have read, wholly or in part, forced me to accept a new interpretation of Lolita. I didn't want to make this video. I really did like Nabokov's prose, his wit, his self-referentiality, and I wanted to love his work without being ashamed of it, without feeling a bit gross. Let me walk you through these 3 stages, through Lolita, through Nabokov's life, and through some of his other works. You can judge for yourself. Does Lolita need to be reconsidered? I won't be discussing either of the movie adaptations. It can't be ignored how big their cultural impact was and continues to be, but that's not exactly what I want to talk about today. This video is brought to you by the concept of death. It's coming for you. Part 1. Considering Lolita. For most people, Lolita is the beginning and the end of Vladimir Nabokov. It was certainly my only point of reference when I started reading. It catapulted him to international fame and made him one of the 20th century's most celebrated writers. Lolita is the 19th best-selling novel of all time. It would be higher if not for the Harry Potter books sitting just above it. You'd be hard-pressed to find a list of 100 books to read before you die that doesn't include at least one of his novels. He influenced a whole generation of writers with his lyrical prose and depth of description. It's hard to overstate his effect on literature in the second half of the 20th century. For those of you who haven't read Lolita, let me briefly summarise the plot. There's some key facts we're going to need moving forward, and I think it's important to understand the strange piece of work that is by far Nabokov's most famous. They told me that lead paint on the walls was going to be a bad idea, but you know what? I feel great. Lolita begins with a foreword from a fictional academic, John Ray Jr., PhD. He informs us that the following account is that of a recently deceased Humbert, dead in prison from a heart problem, just before his trial was set to begin. So right away, Nabokov is forcing the narrator and the reader apart. Even before you meet him, you're being told explicitly, this man cannot be trusted. It's this forced separation of narrator and reader that lets the novel get away with most of its indecent content. The novel then starts proper. The writings of Humbert. A man of Swiss descent, a literature dilettante and sometime translator, Humbert quickly reveals that he has a proclivity for underage girls. He introduces us to his concept of a nymphette. Humbert says, quote, "Between the ages of 9 and 14, there occur maidens who, to certain bewitched travellers, twice or many times older than they, reveal their true nature, which is not human, but nymphic, that is, demonic, and these chosen creatures I propose to designate as nymphets." A nymphette is, quote, "the little deadly demon among the wholesome children." Let me just really underline this for a second. The word nymphette is one Nabokov made up and used in the mouth of Humbert. It's used to describe the way Humbert thinks about children he finds sexually appealing. Humbert dehumanizes them, calls them demonic, but in reality they're just children. Distinguishing at all between a child and a nymphette is inherently paedophilic. This being the case, I won't be using the word outside of quotations, and honestly I'm a little amazed at how common the word seems to have become in the discourse surrounding the book. A 1958 review by Scottish writer Donald Malcolm was titled Lo, the Poor Nymphette. Malcolm seemed perfectly comfortable using the new word, and the New Yorker saw it fit to publish. More than that, related words like nympholepsy and nympholeptic seem to be used as if they were different from paedophilia and paedophile, respectively. So just understand moving forward that when someone uses the word nymphette, they're talking about a child. Humbert Humbert eventually makes his way to America, where circumstance lands him in a lodging house in a small New England town called Ramsdale. It's here he meets Dolores Hayes, or as he calls her, Lolita. Dolores is 12 when they meet. The skeleton of the remainder of the story is what I want to focus on here, so let me cut out a good bit of the detail. Humbert quickly becomes obsessed with young Dolores. Later, Dolores' mother, Charlotte, reveals she's in love with Humbert, and if they can't be together, then Humbert will have to leave. To keep his contact with Dolores, Humbert decides to marry Charlotte. He toys with the idea of killing Charlotte so that he can have Dolores all to himself, but in the end he can't bring himself to do it. Fortunately for Humbert, however, Charlotte soon dies in a car accident. He takes custody of Dolores, rapes her daily for many years, and coerces her with threats of what will happen if she goes to the police. This is the core of the story, the central crux that I want to highlight. Grown man wants little girl, God, this is gross. Man wants little girl, man marries mother to get close to little girl, mother is removed from situation, leaving man and little girl alone. Reductive, yes, but you'll see why a bit later on. The bridge comes later when, at 14, Dolores runs away with another older man, a playwright called Quincy, whom she later leaves after refusing to act in his pornographic films. Humbert desperately looks for Dolores for years, his madness and paranoia growing, before he receives a letter from 17-year-old Dolores. She's married and pregnant and needs money so that her and her husband can move to Alaska. This is also when we realise that the fictional academic in the foreword sort of spoiled the ending, the death in childbirth of one Mrs. Richard F. Schiller, who we now realise is Dolores. Humbert tracks her down and begs her one last time to be with him, but she refuses. Driven mad, Humbert tracks Quincy down and murders him. It's this murder, not the way he treated Dolores, that lands him in prison. And that's the story, minus a bunch of details. But this summary is missing something, and that's how the book felt. When I look back over Lolita, my time with it is characterised by two things. Firstly, the paedophilic imagery. It's a memoir from the point of view of a monster, and as such, there are many descriptions of children in sexual contexts. Some reviews I've seen say something like, there's no actual pornographic content, as in, it never uses the word penis, but there's plenty of implied pornographic content. Phrases like, thrust himself up to the hilt in his youthful bride, and Dolly put her inky, chalky, red-knuckled hand under the desk. No, I wouldn't call Lolita titillating, but it's not erotic. But, since it's all filtered through the mind and eyes of Humbert Humbert, you understand that it's not Nabokov doing the sexualizing. The first person allows an author the opportunity to explore their characters from the inside, even one that they might find repulsive, and Lolita is the ultimate expression of that idea. A first-person protagonist you're forced to empathise with by the structure of the medium, but who you find deeply repulsive. Boy, it sure is a good thing Lolita is in the first person. If, hypothetically, it were in the third person, and all that weird perverted stuff were presented positively, that'd be a bit gross. Hypothetically. Secondly, the prose. Nabokov didn't do simple. Everything from the sentences to the paragraphs, the construction of the scenes to the plot reveals, all of it's drenched in this prolixity, this twisting detail. He doesn't ramble, but he never gets straight to the point, and you can bet there'll be little words in French mixed in. Not again. Huh. Coffee free. Here is Humbert creeping up on Dolores. My arms and legs were convex surfaces between which, rather than upon which, I slowly progressed by some neutral means of locomotion. Humbert the wounded spider. I must have taken hours to reach her. Towards her taut little rear I moved like some paralytic, on soft, distorted limbs, in terrible concentration. At last I was right behind her, when I had the unfortunate idea of blustering a trifle, shaking her by the scruff of her neck and that sort of thing to cover my real menage. And she said in a shrill, brief whine, "Cut it out," most coarsely, the little wench, with a ghastly grin, Humbert the Humble beat a gloomy retreat, while she went on wisecracking streetward. To Nabokov, it isn't breathing, it's respiration. Not fingers, but phalanges. It's not for kids, it belonged to the type of whimsy for juvenile consumption. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'll admit I found some passages really beautiful. Overall, I'd say it gets a bit tiring, but that's just a matter of taste. Not all writing needs to be stripped to the bone, and sometimes I'm in the mood for something more lush and meandering. This is just the way Nabokov writes. Now, some of you might be thinking, since Lolita is in the first person, this isn't the way Nabokov writes, this is the way Humbert writes. You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you know everything. I've been told I do a good Clint Eastwood impression. You ready? In fact, we can't make any deductions about the man Nabokov from Lolita the novel. It's just one novel, and it's drenched in character. Let's get a better idea of Vladimir Nabokov. Part 2. Considering Nabokov. Vladimir Vladimirovich Nabokov, or Nabokov, he was fine with both, has a fascinating life story. To any of you familiar with Tolstoy's novels, his early life will be instantly recognisable. He was born in St. Petersburg into an aristocratic family in 1899. In his autobiography, Speak Memory, published in 1951, he recounts some of his earliest memories. Riding with his mother in a horse-drawn sleigh, using imported English soap, learning to draw and speak French with his many tutors, watching his father speak to the local peasants from the balcony of their manor. The idea of a man like this later staying in a motel or visiting a Dairy Queen is amazing to me.
Я весьма озадачен.
Я весьма озадачен. His father was a liberal politician who, after the first 1970 revolution, took part in Kerensky's short-lived provisional government. As things started to turn Bolshevik-wards, Nabokov's family first fled to Crimea, then to Berlin, where he spent the next 2 decades. Berlin is where Nabokov wrote his first novels, married his wife Vera, had his son Dmitri. He worked as a translator, tutor, occasional poet, and, in his free time, composer of chess puzzles. He didn't mind a good game of chess, but he really enjoyed composing elegant chess puzzles, like this one. White Mates in 2. Have a go if you like. On the eve of the Second World War, Nabokov again fled west, first to Paris, and then, as the Nazis advanced, to America. In 1939, he wrote his last novel in Russian, and in 1941, he published his first in English. He lectured at Wellesley College, then Cornell, spending his free time writing and hunting butterflies. He had a real lifelong passion for lepidoptery, or studying butterflies. A number of species are named by or after him. After the wild success of Lolita in the late 50s, he could afford to move to Switzerland and focus on his writing. It's here he died in 1977 at the age of 78. Let me briefly mention a piece of trivia I've seen floating around in connection with Nabokov's uncle Ruka. In his autobiography, Speak Memory, Nabokov says, quote, "When I was 8 or 9, Uncle Ruka would invariably take me upon his knee after lunch and fondle me with crooning sounds and fancy endearments." Along with some other vague details of inheritance, some commentators have taken this to mean that Nabokov was sexually abused. I won't try and do any armchair psychiatry. Yeah, it does seem odd that someone would mention that so casually, but frankly all we can say is that we don't have enough information to draw any conclusions. In my opinion, it's not a particularly important question anyway. What does it matter what happened to him as a child? All that matters is the man he grew up to become. Nabokov was certainly an intelligent man. You can see this everywhere in his work, frankly to an obnoxious degree. He loved filling his books with puzzles and puns, references and overlapping allusions. Nowhere is this puzzle, pun, self-referentiality more clear than in his last completed novel, Look at the Harlequins, from 1974. A fantastic summary by Roy Johnson perfectly untangles one of these puzzles. Bear with me on this one. The main character of Look at the Harlequins is a writer who writes a fictitious novel called The Dare, in which there's a character called Victor, who's also a writer, who writes a novel which, in description, sounds exactly like one of Nabokov's real other works, 1936's The Gift. The title, The Dare, is a sort of multilingual pun because the original Russian name for The Gift was Dar. It's not surprising to learn that Nabokov also composed Russian crosswords while living in Berlin. Nabokov was also fond of lying to journalists, though I'm not sure whether this was about fun riddles or him trying to control his public image. For example, in a 1967 interview, Herbert Gold asked him if he had learnt anything from teaching his students at Cornell. Nabokov replied, quote, "My method of teaching precluded genuine contact with my students." This is an interesting thing to say, considering that it's well documented that Nabokov and his wife Vera hosted dinners for students. It's also interesting considering that in the winter of 1943, Nabokov had an affair with one of his students, a junior at Cornell, but more on that later. In the 1973 introduction to his non-fiction collection Strong Opinions, Nabokov gave us some insight into how he dealt with journalists. Quote, "Nowadays I take every precaution to ensure a dignified beat of the Mandarin's fan. The interviewer's questions have to be sent to me in writing, answered by me in writing, and produced verbatim. Such are the three absolute conditions." Whether because of, or in spite of, his fondness for puzzles and misdirection, Nabokov has become one of the most popular and most analysed writers of the 20th century. Tens of thousands of academic and popular articles have been published about him and his work, with more appearing every year. The International Vladimir Nabokov Society has a dedicated journal, the Nabokovian, which has been published twice a year, every year, since 1978. His writing really is prime material for going over with a fine-tooth comb, looking for little riddles and allusions. This might be why Nabokov scholars tend to be the obsessive sort. In 1969, Nabokov released Poems and Problems, a collection that's 2-part poetry to 1-part chess puzzles. Today, you can find dozens of articles online that try and connect these chess puzzles with features from his novels. This character moved in an L shape, this character sweeps diagonally across the story, that sort of thing. One well-known scholar, Professor Brian Boyd, as well as writing 4 books on Nabokov and editing 3 more, also runs a meticulously annotated version of Nabokov's longest work, Ada or Ada, A Family Chronicle, online that's still been updated after 32 years. In short, the man's got fans. Let me briefly talk about Lolita's book covers. You'll see it said all over the place that Nabokov was screwed over when it came to covers for Lolita. He never wanted depictions of girls on the cover. He wrote to his first American publisher, quote, "I want pure colours, melting clouds, accurately drawn details, a sunburst over a receding road with the light reflected in furrows and ruts after rain, and no girls." People have taken this to mean that Nabokov didn't want to encourage the sexualization of the girl in the book. Putting a pretty girl on the cover would go against the whole point of the book, he's saying. Nabokov would be disgusted to his core if he saw what kind of covers they were putting on his novel.
I have here some, not all, some of the editions of Lolita. One of my favorite ones is, that's a very pretty edition, I find. You have here, you say, that's a French edition, and you have here, other side, delightful French edition. This is beautiful, that's a Dutch edition. Isn't it nice? Beautifully done. Absolutely charming Dutch.
That widely repeated melting clouds and no girls line comes from a 1958 letter that Nabokov wrote to one Walter J. Minton. The letter goes on to say, "If we cannot find that kind of artistic and virile painting, let us settle for an immaculate white jacket, rough textured paper instead of the usual glossy kind, with Lolita in bold black lettering." In 2013's Lolita, The Story of a Cover Girl, John Bertrand and Yuri Leving suggest that the reason Nabokov didn't want a little girl on the cover had less to do with him not wanting people to sexualize the character and more to do with the book's marketability. Paperback novels at the time were still heavily associated with pulp fiction, crime, western, romance, and these stories traditionally had drawings on the cover. Compare the covers of some popular genre fiction at the time with the covers of, say, John Steinbeck's East of Eden, first published in 1952, or the first edition of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, first published in 1957. As The Story of a Cover Girl goes on to say, Nabokov, quote, "wanted to draw a line between highbrow and lowbrow fiction. Hardback edition, special textured paper, and no girls." From the 60s onwards, Nabokov stopped objecting to depictions of girls on the cover. He'd already succeeded in making Lolita literature. So, I've mentioned the word nymphette, how Humbert used it to classify young girls he thought were sexually malicious demons in disguise. It perfectly encapsulates Humbert's self-justification, the warped distinctions of a crazy man. People in the 70-odd years since might have and reinterpreted the word, but Nabokov always meant for it to be used in the mouth of Humbert Humbert. Here's a line Nabokov wrote about the first time he saw photographs of Sue Lyon, the girl who would go on to play Lolita in Kubrick's film adaptation. My final meeting with Kubrick must have taken place on September 25th, 1960, at his house in Beverly Hills. He showed me that day photographs of Sue Lyon, a demure nymphette of 14 or so. Why don't we play a game? Time for a bit of audience participation. You just think the answers really loud, and I'll be able to hear them. It's a nightmare. On screen are the 19 novels Nabokov wrote in his lifetime, including the 2009 publication he was working on when he died. I'm going to split them into two groups, A and B, and you see if you can guess what the grouping is. First round, Group A and Group B. Time's up. Did you get it? Group A is all those books originally written in Russian, and Group B are all those written originally in English. The Enchanter's a bit of a special case since it was written in Russian, but then translated and released in English. Who's up for round two? Group A, Group B. And that's time. The answer is that Group A are all those novels that have been adapted into feature films, and Group B are those that haven't. This is fun. Why don't we do one more? See if you can spot the theme here. Group A, Group B. This one's a bit trickier. Did you spot it? Group A, consisting of 11 books, or just over half the total, are all the books that feature the nudity, sexualization, or outright sexual abuse of underage girls. This is a thorny topic, and one I want to approach with care. I count 11 books, but that number depends on where you draw the line, what counts as sexualization. The Nabokov scholar Brian Boyd counted only 3, saying that the others were merely Nabokov trying to subvert our expectations. The late Martin Amis, a known Nabokov enjoyer, counted no less than 6, and took issue with some of Boyd's conclusions. I won't claim to know better than either of these scholars. Both understand Nabokov and his work far better than I do, only that I have a different and perhaps more sensitive idea of what crosses the line. So, really, the only way for you to come to your own conclusions is to hear the evidence yourself. Let me go through my list chronologically, which, incidentally, is the same as from least to most problematic, and you can be the judge. I don't want to spoil the plot of, 11 books, so I'll just give you the context you need to understand the gist. Ready? Here we go. Starting mild, we have Glory from 1932. Martin Edelweiss is a Russian man forced to leave his home for Western Europe. While staying with a Russian family in London, he meets Sonia, a girl of 16, who is the main love interest for the remainder of the book. He goes on to study at Cambridge, then moves around Europe. The outright problematic elements in this one are faint. One scene involves Martin hiring a prostitute of unknown age, but certainly young. The adjectives he used to describe her are weird. As soon as they were in the dark of the taxicab, he embraced her, frenzied by the feel of her supple slenderness. He gazed lovingly at her bare, childish shoulders and blonde bob, and felt completely happy. Keep an eye on this blondness for later. While we're at it, keep an eye on the phrase bare shoulders. Another scene involves Martin eating at a cafe and catching sight of, quote, a young girl at the nearest table, holding her pencil the way children do. He paid for his meal and, planning to follow her, began waiting for her to get up. But when she had finished writing, she leaned her elbows on the table and continued to sit there. Martin waits a bit longer, then gives up and leaves, thinking to himself that he only wanted to ask her for a drink. Like I said, faint. It's unclear if either of the girls I mentioned are even underaged, and it can hardly be said to be overtly sexual. Still, I'm including it here because of how well it fits in with the trends in Nabokov's writing yet to come. It's the first drops of a rainstorm. He has novels earlier than this, written in his late 20s, where the theme is even more faint, but still visible. The teenage love affair from Mary in 1926, the odd, bare-shouldered 17-year-old in King, Queen, Knave from 1928. What I'm saying is, even in his novels not principally concerned with pedophilia, you can still find traces, but it's not until his early 30s that the flags really start to turn red. Laughter in the Dark was published in Russian in 1933. The novel follows a middle-aged art critic called Albert Albanus. Nabokov seemed to like naming his characters like superhero alter egos. It's probably a whole reference to his own name, Vladimir Vladimirovich, but then he's switched from Russian to English, so Vladimir Vladimirovich becomes like John Johnson, Jack Jackson, I guess. Old Bert falls in love with a cinema usher, Margot Peters, who is 16 when they first meet, and living with her aunt. At one of his dinner parties, Bertie unwittingly introduces Margot to an old lover of hers, Axel Rex. I can't say that any other way, it's just Axel Rex. I like to think Axel Rex rides everywhere on a skateboard and has like big anime spikes in his hair. Margot and her former lover, Axel Rex, reconnect and take advantage of Albert, trying to steal his money while avoiding suspicion. The narration is third person and describes the, quote, childish solemnity in Margot's eyes, her childishly upturned face. This makes it a real lurch when Albert thinks, quote, I must get her to my room, curse that aunt, we shall be alone, quite alone, a textbook of love for beginners. Oh, the things I shall teach her, so young, so pure, so maddening. To reiterate, Albert is no Humbert. He's meant to be the sympathetic hero of the story. This idea of maddening sexuality is one Nabokov returns to quite a lot. It's clear in Lolita, and we'll see more examples soon. What I found interesting about Laughter in the Dark is that the story would function perfectly well if Margot was aged up to 20 or 25 or even 30. There might have been room for some character depth, a more complex than layered relationship with her past lover. I can't think what the story gains by making her 16. Axel Rex. Invitation to a Beheading from 1936 is a deeply surreal, dreamlike story. It concerns a 30-year-old man, Cincinnatus C., awaiting execution. While imprisoned, he's visited by strange figures, members of his family, and the daughter of the prison director, 12-year-old Emmy. She's described, again by an omnipotent third-person narrator, as having, quote, silky blonde hair, and as, quote, a mere child, but with the marble calves of a little ballerina. Throughout the novel, Cincinnatus constantly tries to find out when he's going to be executed. Here's a scene when little Emmy comes to visit him alone. Sorry for the long quote, but it's not really something I can summarize without putting my own spin on it. Like, is this even weird? Like, I don't even know anymore. Fidgeting, Emmy buried her forehead in his chest. Her curls tumbling and hanging to one side revealed the bare upper part of her back, which had a hollow that moved with her shoulder blades and was evenly covered with a blonde down, which looked as though it had been combed in a symmetrical pattern. Cincinnatus stroked her warm head, trying to raise it. She snatched his fingers and began pressing them to her quick lips. What a snuggling pet you are, said Cincinnatus drowsily. Tomorrow, she said suddenly, squeezing him and gazing at him between the eyes. Tomorrow I'll die? Asked Cincinnatus. No, I'll rescue you, Emmy said pensively. She was seated astride him. We'll run away and you'll marry me. Maybe when you are a little older. Only I already have one wife. Nabokov's introduction to the 1959 English edition had an interesting line. He writes, quote, the evil-minded will perceive in little Emmy a sister of little Lolita, meaning that before the thing even came out in English, there were people commenting on Nabokov's preoccupation with blonde 12-year-old girls. The Gift, from 1938, is the last of Nabokov's Russian novels, and often considered one of his best. It follows It follows this guy as he meets and falls in love with Zina, a fellow Russian emigre. Fyodor is a young aristocratic Russian living in Berlin in the 20s. He's also a translator, tutor, poet, and amateur composer of chess problems. The author's stand-ins only get more thinly veiled as Nabokov gets older. This is the first of his books we'll be discussing, in which the main character might as well be called Vladimir Nabokov. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Author stand-ins can be an interesting form of self-reflection, but it does seem strange as the sexual elements start to become more prominent. Fyodor gets a few eyebrow-raising lines, like when he hires a prostitute, a, quote, mercenary young German girl, or when he's tutoring Shakespeare to, quote, a schoolgirl in a black jumper whom he sometimes felt like kissing on her bent, yellowish nape. But the main reason I'm including The Gift is because of the following passage. For context, Boris Ivanovich Shogoli, sorry if I'm butchering all these Russian names, I'm doing my best. Shogoli. There's too many consonants and too many vowels. Boris Ivanovich Shogoli is Zina's stepfather. The following passage kind of comes out of nowhere and really seems to only illustrate how Boris likes to mouth off and talk big. Once, when Boris Ivanovich had noticed some written-up sheets of paper on Fyodor's desk, he said, adopting a new heartfelt tone of voice, "Ah, if only I had a tick or two, what a novel I'd whip off. From real life. Imagine this kind of thing. An old dog, but still in his prime, fiery, thirsting for happiness, gets to know a widow, and she has a daughter, still quite a little girl, you know what I mean, when nothing is formed yet, but she already has a way of walking that drives you out of your mind. A slip of a girl, very fair, pale, with blue under the eyes, and of course she doesn't even look at the old goat. What to do? Well, not long thinking, he up and marries the widow. Okay, They settle down, the three of them. Here you can go on indefinitely. The temptation, the eternal torment, the itch, the mad hopes. Just a bit familiar, don't you think? In all seriousness, Nabokov was a man who liked to leave references and allusions across multiple novels. It's like Easter eggs, but with pedophilia. If you're feeling lenient, you could call this a kind of proof of concept for a book he hadn't written yet. Still, I find it off-putting that the story of man marries mother to get close to child isn't presented as perverted or strange. It's mentioned in passing as the eccentric ideas of a gentleman and never mentioned again. It's not just in The Gift that the story that would one day become Lolita appears. The Enchanter is a novella written around 1939, which I'm not going to cover fully because it's effectively the same plot as Lolita, only shorter and with a different ending. It wasn't released until after Nabokov's death, and now only serves to illustrate, along with this weird aside in The Gift, that Nabokov certainly had the idea for Lolita at least 15 years before its publication. This is interesting, since Nabokov tried to explain the inspiration for Lolita in the books afterward. Ever skilled at controlling his public image, Nabokov says he got the idea in late 1939 or early 1940, when he read a news story about an ape that used charcoal to draw the bars of its cage. The Gift shows us that he had the premise for Lolita no later than 1937, the date he finished The Gift according to his foreword in the 1962 edition. If we expand the subject to include all stories of older men with girls aged between 12 and 14, Lolita's age during her time with Humbert Humbert, then we can trace the first examples all the way back to 1926 with a short story called A Nursery Tale, but we'll get back to that. Pale Fire is a masterwork of metafiction. It's told in the form of a poem by fictional poet John Shade, with commentary by a fictional academic, Charles Kinbote. The novel earns its place in this conversation because of a very minor character, a farmer's daughter named Gar. Now, I hesitated over mentioning Pale Fire, because Gar's age is never given explicitly, but I figured I'd include it in the list, and you could make up your own minds whether or not this counts as paedophilic imagery. Gar is introduced with, quote, "There appeared a dishevelled young hussy wearing only a man's shirt that came down to her pink shins and an oversized pair of brogues. A moment later, as in a transformation act, she reappeared, her yellow hair still hanging lank and loose, but the dirty shirt replaced by a dirty pullover. Someone wearing a shirt that comes down to their shins and wearing oversized shoes certainly reads as child-coded to me. That or she's a grown woman who, lives with an NBA player or something." And barely a page later, we get, quote, "Zemblan mountain girls are, as a rule, mere mechanisms of haphazard lust, and Gar was no exception. As soon as she had settled beside him, she bent over and pulled over and off her tousled head, the thick grey sweater revealing her naked back and blancmange breasts." My more continental homies might already know, but I had to look up what blancmange was. So, those are the ones that are up for debate. Lolita and the Enchanter are the only two we've seen that unequivocally include problematic imagery. You might want to argue that the Enchanter was really a first draft of Lolita, and Lolita goes out of its way to describe how bad men like Humbert Humbert are. In fact, I don't think any of the other ones are that bad. They're all pretty vague, and he wrote them when he was young, so he's off the hook, right? Ha 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 ha. Don't make me laugh. Let's consider Nabokov's later works, the ones he wrote between the age of 70 and 78. Forewarning, here's where things get especially explicit. I've cut out a lot of the detail, but feel free to skip forward to the next section. What I'm trying to get across here is that Nabokov's work is filled with loads of small Lolita stories and Lolita moments. In Lolita itself, this is justified. In many of the other novels, it isn't. If the story is filtered through the villain's eyes, then perversion can be justified. If the narrator is third person, if the perverted elements are presented as neutral or even positive, then it can't. Nowhere is this better shown than in Nabokov's longest novel, Ada. Ada, or Ada, Family Chronicle, was written in English and came out in 1969. It's a bit of a mission to say out loud. The name Ada, in a Russian accent, apparently sounds more like Ada, which is meant to be a kind of pun on the Russian word for hell. I don't get it. Ada is over 600 pages. It's also a relentlessly horny book. This wouldn't be an issue if it weren't for the fact that many of the participants are under the age of 16. The novel takes place in an alternate history version of Earth called Demonia, or Anti-Terror, where large portions of North America are French and Russian speaking, and some contemporary technology doesn't exist or exists sooner. There's also a running thing where crazy people have hallucinations about the real world, but it's all a bit vague. Martin Amis called Ada, quote, that incontinent splurge, saying it is a waterlogged corpse at the stage of maximal bloat. Clearly some people like it, however. I've already mentioned Professor Brian Boyd and his extensive and ongoing online annotation. Alfred Appel Jr., another big name in Nabokov studies, though from an early generation, called it an erotic masterpiece that explores the nature of time. The story concerns the romantic and sexual relationship of two siblings, Van Veen and Ada Veen. It follows them growing up, growing apart, and reconnecting right up until their old age. By the way, Van is short for Ivan. He's not named after like a Ford Transit. When their sexual relationship starts, Van is 14 and Ada is 12. It's always 12. Keeps coming back to 12. But even aside from that relationship, the book is just absolutely filled with paedophilic imagery. It's almost too much to comment on. It's on every page. Throwaway lines about a man having a child with a 5-year-old, Van's father, a man of 60, and his relationship with, quote, a difficult nymphette of 10, international series of brothels with children as young as 11. It goes on and on. I can't even quote the actual lines from most of these. The first sex scene is about as explicit as you can get when your language is this flowery. It's quite difficult to read and not at all short. I'm not going to quote it directly. The scene involves 12-year-old Ada using her hands on her brother rubbing himself against his sister with explicit physical descriptions and explicit dialogue. It reads like porn. There really is no other way to describe it. This scene also involves a bizarre reference to one Mr. Nymphobotamus. No, he wasn't a character in Cats. Old Nymphobotamus is a painter who came to Ada's school to paint, quote, his diminutive nudes, invariably from behind, fig-picking, peach-buttock nymphets straining upward, or else rock-climbing Girl Scouts in bursting shorts. Narratively, this is done to introduce Van's jealousy and the central motif of it driving them apart. Over here in reality, however, it illustrates the core problem with the novel, which is Nabokov's seeming construction of an alternate world where paedophilia and incest are common. I don't mean the whole alternate history, anti-terror stuff. I mean what's considered baseline normal for his characters. No, none of them think pedophilia is legal, but it's a lot more common to the point of normalization. It's later revealed that Ada had 2 relationships with grown men, a music teacher and a neighbour, before turning 16, and it's not presented as harmful or even particularly concerning. And just in case you think the problems go away when Van and Ada grow up, let me introduce you to a third character, their half-sister, Lucette. When Van and Ada start their relationship, Lucette is 9, and there's a interesting scene where Van and Ada give Lucette a bath with weirdly specific physical description before the 2 older children have sex in the same bathroom. Again, I'm not going to quote this. I will quote one section, however. Demonetization be damned. Did I mention I now have a Patreon? It's when Van is 17, Ada is 15, and Lucette is, you guessed it, 12. It's a scene that, in its conception, its construction, in its execution, cannot justify itself. Yes, why? Growled Ada with a shiver of pleasure, and, leaning over, kissed Van on the mouth. He struggled to rise. The 2 girls were now kissing him alternately, then kissing each other, then getting busy upon him again. Ada in perilous silence, Lucette with soft squeals of delight. 17, 15, 12. With scenes like this, you have to ask yourself, from a storytelling point of view, why is this scene necessary? Why is this level of detail necessary? Lolita has answers to those questions. This doesn't. Ada is the novel where Nabokov's restraint vanishes and all his gross predilections rise to the surface. His interest in 12-year-old girls, blonde girls, incest, the use of the word nymphette, the use of the phrase a slip of a girl. Read by itself, it's concerning. In the larger context of his work, it's outright disturbing. And we've still got 3 books to go. Transparent Things is a novella from 1972. While it isn't as outright gross as Ada, few things are, honestly, it's still rife with the same themes. The story concerns Hugh Person, yes, that's his name, on his many visits to Switzerland to visit a famous eccentric author, Mr. R. While in Switzerland, he meets 23-year-old Amande. While in Switzerland, he meets 23-year-old Armand. whom he later marries. The story hits all the same Nabokov notes: lust, sexual failure, author stand-ins, stepdads, the destruction of the self. In all, it's a story that will feel familiar if you've read any of his other work. So you can bet it gets disgusting when it comes to children. A friend of Aramandi is Julia. Julia is Mr. R's former stepdaughter. Mr. R sexually assaulted Julia when she was 13, which is revealed in just the strangest way. Hugh and Julia go to see a play, right? This is later when Julia's older. After the play, Hugh takes Julia back to his place. Quote, unwisely he wondered, after a too passionate kiss in the taxi had led him to spill a few fire drops of impatience, if he would not disappoint the expectations of Julia, who, according to Phil, had been debauched at 13 by R, right at the start of her mother's disastrous marriage. Then, after they get back to his, quote, naturally, after a decent interval, the child gave in, and soon found herself assisting Big Hugh in his blundersome lovemaking. Why am I getting Boris Johnson flashbacks? It's also worth mentioning that the reason Mr. R's marriage to Julia's mother, Marion, fell apart was because of an affair with a man called Christian Pines. What a name! Mr. R didn't mind that so much, since he was having an affair with his stepdaughter Julia, then aged 18. What did matter is when he found out that Julia was also having an affair with the same Christian Pines. I think we properly crossed the line into the pornographic, if that threesome and Ada wasn't enough. Aside from the whole Mr. R Julia thread, there are still so many weird lines. A throwaway line in Hugh's diary reads, quote, spoke to a girl on the train, adorable brown naked legs and golden sandals, a schoolboy's insane desire, lovely girl, lovely wake of the sun through semi-transparent black fabric. Another moment sees Hugh in Armandi's childhood home, left alone with a family photo album. Not only do the snapshots follow Armand through all the phases of the past and all the improvements of amateur photography, but the girl also came in various states of innocent undress. Her parents and aunts believed in the fact a girl child of 10, the dream of Ludwigian, had the same right to total nudity as an infant. Throwing Ludwigian into Google shows it's a reference to Charles Ludwig Dodgson, otherwise known as Mr. Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, a man who may have liked looking at photographs of naked children, but that's a whole nother topic. Hugh Person, quote, returned several times to the pictures of little Armand in her bath, pressing a proboscidate rubber toy to her shiny stomach, or standing up, dimple-bottomed, to be lathered. I don't like the word lathered in this context. Then he heard a toilet flush upstairs and, with a guilty wince, slapped the thick book shut. His retractile heart moodily withdrew, its throbs quietened. Nabokov's style goes a long way to shield the reader from the worst, or rather the ubiquity, of his gross horniness. Saying, spill a few fire drops of impatience doesn't sound as bad as prematurely coming in the back of a taxi. Saying, deflowered and infet doesn't sound as bad as raped a child. I don't think this was intentional, it's just the way the guy writes. But there are moments where it feels like he's actively trying to misdirect you. For example, in Transparent Things, he writes, Jacques demanded her presence at the onanistic sessions he held with the Blake twins at their chalet. This sounds a lot better than saying Jack asked her to come over and watch him and his friends jerk off. In many ways, 1974's look at the Harlequins is the ultimate culmination of everything we've seen so far. It's the most Nabokov. His favourite themes, allusions to real life, surrogate fathers, romance, are found on every page, for better and for worse. His verbose style swells to the point that some passages are borderline incomprehensible, but not without the odd beautiful line. I was so close to getting through this whole session without spilling coffee myself. Fucking hell. Oh, gosh. I want everyone to know I'm sitting on a wet patch of coffee. And of course, his own personal brand of perversion reaches its peak. We've seen how Nabokov's interests alternated between little girls, stepfathers, and incest. Well, in Look at the Harlequins, these themes finally join together. Bluntly, it features a man being aroused to the point of orgasm by his own 11-year-old daughter. The story concerns Vadim Vadimovich N., Russian chess player, writer, American lecturer, you get the gist. As he writes best-selling novels, collects butterflies, and travels around America. The central thread of the story concerns Vadim's ill-fated marriages, 4 in all, as well as a few affairs. Vadim's first wife, Iris Black, is murdered by a man we assume to be her lover. After her death, while staying with a friend, Vadim meets a girl of 11, Dolly Borg. The familiar Lolita setup ensues as Vadim starts to lust after Dolly. He's kept awake by thoughts of her and eventually has to leave the house while Dolly is out of the country. Vadim and Dolly have a sexual affair years later when Dolly is 24. They run into each other in New York and Dolly comes to visit him at his university. Vadim says, quote, "I hastened to quench a thirst that had been burning a hole in the mixed metaphor of my life ever since I had fondled a quite different Dolly 13 years earlier." I don't like the word fondled either. Fondled, lathered. Oh no. Between these two interactions with Dolly, Vadim marries a second time and has a daughter, Belle. It's that affair with grown-up Dolly that ends his second marriage, and his wife takes Belle away with her. But some years later, his second ex-wife dies in a tornado, meaning Belle comes to live with him. Dies in a tornado? And then God killed her. Quote, "With Belle nearing her 13th birthday, I was still deliriously happy. Save for a few insignificant lapses, a few hot drops of overflowing tenderness, a gasp marked by a cough, and that sort of stuff, my relations with her had remained essentially innocent." What the fuck? Vadim then marries a third time, a widow of a colleague called Louise. Belle is sent off to school in Switzerland, and Louise soon leaves him. Vadim's fourth and final wife isn't named, only referred to in the second person you, but is described to be the same age as his daughter, since the two were classmates. When their relationship begins, he is nearing 70 and she is in her early 20s. See, I know you can't judge a person's character from one piece of fiction. It's only when you look at someone's whole body of work that you can deduce what topics they liked coming back to and thinking about over many years. But this gets tricky when the story is so clearly intended to be a fictionalized author stand-in autobiography. Vadim says he feels like a copy of a different, better writer, and towards the end, after a stroke, he thinks that his name might actually be Vladimir Nabokov. Vadim and Vladimir share a lot of the same opinions. Vadim rails against Marx and Freud, against bad translators and booksellers. No Nabokov dislikes. The one novel that makes Vadim a big-name writer is a controversial novel called Kingdom by the Sea, which is a direct reference to a line from Lolita. I've already mentioned the whole the gift, the dare thing, but there's also Adis, Slaughter in the Sun, and Sea Under Real, a reference to the real life of Sebastian Knight, another Nabokov work we haven't talked about. Nabokov goes out of his way to outline the plots of these stories to make the illusions as clear as possible. So what are we meant to make of the main character's obvious perversions? One of Adam's books is called The Red Topper, which is clearly described to be Invitation to a Beheading, the one with the prison director's daughter, Emmy. But in the world of Look at the Harlequins, Amy, as the parallel character is called, is directly based off 11-year-old Dolly, who Vadim is sexually attracted to. I have no idea how to interpret this. It's so obvious, it's like Nabokov is telling on himself, actively contradicting things he said about his work. But at the same time he was writing this, he was denying that there were any paedophilic themes in his work. Is the whole thing just some elaborate double bluff? Is he a crazy man? Am I a crazy man? I'm starting to see why so many Nabokov scholars go off the deep end. Finally, we arrive at the original of Laura, published posthumously in 2009. Nabokov requested for his early draft, written out on index cards, to be burned if he didn't finish it for his death. His wife Vera declined to do so, and after her death, Dmitri, their son, decided to publish. The story is so patchy and incomplete it hardly warrants talking about. It's not exactly fair to judge the style of the thing. You can't exactly judge someone based on something they wanted to have burned. The story that is there hits the usual notes. The 12-year-old this time around is Flora. The man doing the harassing this time around is the, quote, elderly but still vigorous Englishman, Hubert H. Hubert, though he quickly dies. Flora loses her virginity at 14 before the story frays completely. In all, there's not a lot you can say about the original of Laura, apart from it goes through the same motions we've seen so many times already. 12-year-old girls, perverted older men, the word coeval. Is that how you pronounce Shit. Is that how you pronounce that?
Coeval.
Coeval? Fuck off. 12-year-old girls, perverted older men, the word coeval, and children under the age of 16 having sex. So this is how it ends, huh? Not with a bang, but with a... Oh no, I guess it does end with a bang. God damn, that was in poor taste. Before we move on, let me briefly mention a few other pieces from Nabokov's oeuvre. In what world? A Nursery Tale is a short story from 1926. It's the earliest example I could find of what would become the classic Nabokov perversion. The story features a man making a deal with the devil. He gets to choose as many women off the street as he likes to magically become willing sex partners for one night only. One of those he chooses is, quote, a child of 14 or so in a low-cut black party dress. She's walking down the street with an older man the protagonist assumes to be her grandfather. The only thing that stops the protagonist from having his way with a 14-year-old and many other unwilling women is that he accidentally chooses the same person twice, thus invalidating the devil's deal. When Nabokov wrote the translation in 1975, he wrote that he was, quote, eerily startled to meet a somewhat decrepit but unmistakable Humbert escorting his nymphette, referring to the man the protagonist assumes was the grandfather. Again, this contradicts the idea that Nabokov got the idea for Lolita from that news story about the apes drawing. More importantly, it really illustrates the hold that this idea had on Nabokov's psyche. From one of the first things he ever published to the last words he was writing when he died, Nabokov was thinking about relationships with underage girls. Lastly, I want to mention a poem. Lilith was written in Russian in 1928, but not published until 1970. It's worth mentioning, in my opinion, because it's about as direct as Nabokov's writing gets with regards to children. It drops all pretense. Some bits are too explicit for YouTube, but I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested. The poem is about a recently murdered man waking up in heaven. In a doorway there stood a naked little girl. She had a water lily in her curls and was as graceful as a woman. The girl then takes the man by his... She lies down and with a wild... He... into the... The girl then flees, leaving him unsatisfied. He the floor and realises he's in hell. You can find this poem in Penguin's Modern Classics range as part of Nabokov's collected poems. When this poem was published, Nabokov included an author's note. Composed more than 40 years ago to amuse a friend, Lilith could not be published in any of the sedate émigré periodicals of the time. Intelligent readers would abstain from examining this impersonal fantasy for any links with my later fiction. Just like with Emmy in Invitation to a Beheading, Nabokov was all too aware that people were seeing certain themes run through his work. His defence seems to be saying that only intelligent readers, only readers who aren't evil-minded, will understand. If you think you see a trend, well, you're clearly not an intelligent reader. I wonder if he genuinely believed that. I wonder if he was cognizant of his own tendencies. Also, sorry, but what kind of friend are you writing this for? I didn't realise Nabokov was tight with Drake. Nice bit of topical humour for you right there. You might be watching this and asking a fairly reasonable question given the evidence. Did Nabokov ever behave inappropriately to children in real life? All the evidence I've seen from the time and since point undeniably to no, he did not. He may have returned to this theme over and over in his fiction, but this never seems to have crossed over into his actions. The only information I could find about his sexual interests, outside of his long marriage with his wife Vera, was from Stacy Schiff's 1999 Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Vera, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov. Schiff writes, quote, Nabokov's attention was reserved for the best-looking girls in the class. I took a course in Russian, and I got sidetracked on a course on Vladimir Nabokov, recalled Catherine Reese-Peebles, a junior who interviewed the new professor for the school paper in 1943, and who was as well placed as anyone to testify. He did like young girls, just not little girls. Schiff goes on to describe how Nabokov had an affair with Miss Peebles, which she later ended. For context, Miss Peebles would have been 19 or 20, and Nabokov would have been 44. I've tried to be as thorough as I can through a combination of my own reading, articles, and summaries, but I'm sure I've missed examples of elsewhere this theme appears in Nabokov's work. Even as I read more and more, I found my tolerance for grossness change. When I started reading, the hero of the story calling their lover childish rang alarm bells. By the end, I found myself ignoring whole sections because, yeah, that's weird, but is it as weird as Ada? What I'm trying to say is, I hope I've presented enough information clearly and evenly so we can finally get back to the beginning of this video and ask the question, do we need to reconsider Lolita? Part 3. Reconsidering Nabokov. Nabokov is often hailed as a genius. His work with butterflies, his skill in chess, his linguistic ability, all of it positions him in our culture as the classic Renaissance man, someone set apart from the rest of us by the strength of his intellect and the power of his creativity. I don't know whether I'd go that far. Yeah, his writing was very dense and complex, but I've always felt truly genius writers make their work feel effortless. Regardless, Nabokov's label as a genius seems to have protected him from criticism over what he chose to write about. Intelligence and good morals are often conflated, so we can't accept that someone so brilliant would choose to write such abhorrent things just because. He must have had some deeper purpose that I can't understand. He was a genius, so who am I to question him? It's important that the first of his works to unavoidably and unequivocally include pedophilic content was Lolita, his most successful novel by far. A surface-level reading of Lolita makes it look gross beyond description, and it isn't until you really engage with the text that these concerns resolve. Because of this, calling Nabokov's work problematic is often dismissed as an unrefined opinion. It comes from someone who tossed Lolita aside when it got challenging and didn't really understand the work. Even as I've been working on this video, when I mention to people the problematic content rampant within Nabokov's work, the most common answer I get is, well, clearly you didn't read Lolita properly. Lolita prepared the public for his later works. It inoculated readers. People who read Ada or Transparent Things thought back to Lolita and said, well, yes, this seems gross, but clearly I'm not understanding the artistry behind it. They assume a man known for his genius would have a more profound meaning behind these sexual depictions of children because that's how it was in Lolita. This, combined with the density of his prose and the complexity of his wordplay, seems to have made Nabokov's intentions outside the realm of discussion. You're just not smart enough to see the beauty in his work. You might disagree. As we've seen, people who love Nabokov's work get very good at explaining away his predilections. This piece was really a reference to this piece, and this piece is a commentary on that other piece, so really they don't count. You can frame it any way you like, but the truth is that for decades, when Nabokov sat down at his desk, took out a sharp pencil and bent over his index cards, he chose to write about children in a sexual context. There really is no other way to look at it. So, do I think that means no one should read his work? Do I think that libraries should burn all their copies and universities should strike him off the curriculum? No. There is nuance here. I find some of Nabokov's work disgusting, but that's true of many writers throughout history. To put it bluntly, if we held every artist throughout history to our modern standards, we wouldn't really have any left. When we use our modern cultural values to evaluate work from other eras, hardly anything comes out looking good. We have to be able to accept that people can make brilliant work and do disgusting things, and to extol the one is not to condone the other. The reason I made this video, then, is not to disparage anyone who likes Nabokov's writing, but to give context to people who maybe aren't as familiar with his whole body of work. The first book I read of his was Lolita. I read the preface, I read the piece, I read Nabokov's afterword, I read some articles online and some analysis, and nowhere did I see it mentioned about how much Nabokov liked to write about underage girls. This left me without the full picture. I lacked the necessary context to understand what I had just read. When you read Kipling, you're told about his views on colonialism. When you read Lovecraft, you're told some of his views on race and how that might have affected his work. And when you read Nabokov, you should be aware of his fondness for sexualizing children. As of now, that's not the case. Part 4. Reconsidering Lolita. I don't like talking about classics. Rather, I don't like making videos about them. I could work for decades and not come up with anything new or interesting to say on Othello or Pride and Prejudice because the ground is just so well trodden. There are people more qualified, more knowledgeable, far more intelligent than me who have spent their lives trying to understand these works. I didn't want to talk about Lolita. I read it because it was one of those classics I'd heard about and felt I should read. I enjoyed it and wanted to read more by the same author, and it was only then that I realised that I was missing a key part of the story. In a 2009 Guardian article about the original of Laura, Martin Amis wrote, quote, "Writers like to write about things they like to think about, and, to put it at its sternest, Nabokov's mind, during his last period, insufficiently honoured the innocence, insufficiently honoured the honour of 12-year-old girls. This leaves a faint but visible scar on the leviathan of his corpus." I'm afraid I disagree. For one thing, I disagree that it was only during this last period that Nabokov's mind was drawn to young girls. We've seen how this theme echoes back through his work with varying degrees of clarity. But mainly, I disagree that this leaves only a faint scar. The wound is deep and festering, made the more rotten by our collective ability to ignore it. By all means, read Lolita, enjoy the flow of the prose, but remember, the eyes you're looking through are not only those of Humbert Humbert, but also Nabokov himself, and no matter the riddles and red herrings he throws up to distract you, there is pleasure in that gaze. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to see more videos like this in the future. I love making these videos, but they do take a fair bit of time. I just want to let everyone know that I have a Patreon now. If you like these videos, why not consider supporting the channel? For as little as £2 or $3 a month, you can help me make more and better videos in the future. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.